right, we're going to reconvene. We are honored today to have a panel of this year's Distinguished Teaching Award recipients.
What a pleasure it is to be here with this panel again. We just had the Distinguished Teaching Award ceremony a week or two ago, and it was such a joyful occasion. And I figure this is going to be a joyful occasion as well, as we kind of get a little bit of a more detailed glimpse into what makes distinguished teaching at Berkeley. So I'm going to introduce our distinguished teachers by telling you a little bit about, just a brief bit about their research, because I think that will set the stage for thinking about how it is that you convey that research, how you get students interested in it, how you actually talk about concepts and explain them to students in a variety of ways. And I think it'll be so interesting because our panelists represent such different disciplines. So maybe there will be commonalities that you see across, but maybe you'll see some differences too in the way that these teachers represent their subject matters to their students. So first we have Professor Robert Littlejohn, Professor Emeritus in Physics, who joined the Berkeley faculty in 1983. He has broad interest in atomic, molecular, nuclear, optical, and plasma physics, and in nonlinear dynamics. He's especially interested in mathematical aspects of basic problems in applied physics. I'm already feeling the challenge. Well, Stephen Raphael is Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and holds the James D. Marber Chair at the Goldman School of Public Policy. His research focuses on the economics of low-wage labor markets, housing, and the economics of crime and corrections. And his most recent work focuses on the social consequences of the large increases in U.S. incarceration rates and racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes. And I'll just give you a preview. One of the things that Stephen does in his classes is statistical analysis live. So he has a screen there and he shows students how to do the analysis right there in the middle of class, which impressed all of the committee. Andrea Roth joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 2011 after 3 years as a Gray Fellow at Stanford and 9 years as a trial and appellate public defender in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on the ways in which pedigreed concepts of criminal procedure and evidentiary law must be re-theorized in an era of science-based prosecutions. So I know you all have in your mind some picture of how law school operates and this combative approach of a person who's doing the cold calling in the classroom and so on. So we'll see if that's really the way that
Get ready to be called.
Should I call on you? So it might be a reversal here. And we have Ethan Shagan, a professor in history. He's an historian of early modern Britain in particular, and early modern Europe more generally. His work most often focuses on the interpenetration of religion and politics, and more broadly, on the contested space of religion in the early modern world. And Ethan is going to, I hope at some point, tell us how to create magic in a small seminar, where students are engaged in talking about text and learning the vocabulary and nuances of interpretation. Okay. Maybe. So the way we'll conduct this panel is I have some broad questions that I'll start out asking, but we want it to be interactive. So you should feel free, if the spirit moves you, to ask a question at any time, and then we'll see how it proceeds. And at the end, it'll just be a free-for-all. People can ask whatever they like. But to bring some order to the beginning, I wanted to ask each of our distinguished teachers to talk a little bit about whatever they consider their approach to be to engaging students in learning. We always hear about, wow, students are really engaged, but how does that happen? And is it even something that you think about? Is it automatic in terms of how you set up your course, or is it something that you worry about late at night?
One of us to go
And
first.
so you want us to...
I want you to expound upon. Keep in mind.
All right, should I start?
You should start.
Okay, so how to engage students? I can tell you how I do it. I think that my major ally in engaging students is the beauty of the subject that I teach, which is physics. I think everyone who teaches physics tries to connect what they're doing with current research, and you can do that to some extent. I think at any level in freshman physics you can connect with various areas of current research, and this is very exciting. It's also greatly encouraged these days. As if you listen, I think maybe Microsoft started this about 15 or 20 years ago, is that every sentence had to have the word innovation in it, and now it seems to have spread to academia as well. Well, it's fine as far as it goes, because obviously we're doing research. Cutting edge research is vital for faculty members, and students want to get into that too. But at the same time, my feeling is that what should not be neglected is the history of physics, because it puts the accumulated knowledge of the past into a human context. It's like, how did people feel when this knowledge was first acquired? And this is something that can be done with any period in history. I mean, how did Euclid feel when, or the ancient Greeks feel when they put together mathematics? The Greek mathematics is a remarkable accomplishment. In more recent times, there's if you put the great discoveries into context and you connect them with the emotions of the peoples that made these discoveries, you see that they're from an intellectual standpoint is just as engaging as it is modern discoveries, which are some of which haven't been made yet but are on the verge. So anyway, I try to connect this, and using the historical facts about the development of the subject is part of what I use to engage students. I think the other part of it is related to this is just a projection of enthusiasm about how beautiful the ideas are. This is actually related to this just what I was saying a minute ago. It's the connection with the beauty of the ideas. I try to, I hope I convey that by my own enthusiasm, but also by the presentation and the nature of the topics. I don't want to go on too long. I don't know how much minutes you want me to speak, but.
Well, we're just loving hearing you hold forth. It's pretty wonderful to think about the beauty,
Yeah.
beauty of physics. And
So I'll give you some examples. There's in the 19th century, Fraunhofer discovered dark lines in the spectrum of the sun by just putting sunlight through a prism. And then somewhere around mid 19th century, it was discovered that those dark lines coincide exactly with the bright lines that come from atomic spectra, that you put a sodium in a flame and you look at the same spectra. So the immediate conclusion was, my goodness, we can understand the chemical structure of the sun, which is nearly 100 million miles away, by doing, and this was in the mid 19th century, this realization. And then shortly after that came the realization, it doesn't have to be the sun, you can do this with stars. So you can analyze the chemical composition of stars, which are at least 4 light years away, the nearest star, and many of them much further than that, by doing simple observations on Earth. What an expansion of the ideas, of the concepts in your mind about the understanding, not only the understanding of the power of the knowledge that you have at these enormous distances, but also you've come to the realization that it sure looks like the same laws of physics work in the remote corners of the universe that work here in the laboratories on Earth. So this was enormously mind-expanding, and for the people that were involved in this. That's just one example of this. There's another example. Einstein in 1911 wrote a paper on what's now called the principle of equivalence. It's remarkable because the physics in it is elementary. You can explain it to an upper division student, even lower division students, I think, rather easily. Einstein said afterwards that this idea that lay behind that paper, he called it the luckiest, the glücklichsten Gedanke meines Lebens, the happiest thought of my life was this basic, simple idea. Anyway, the ideas don't have to be complicated. They can be really simple, but can convey so much. And if you just teach it as a dry thing, like, here's how it works and here's the equations, and now without saying where it came from or what was involved in the invention of it, So going into the history of it and the intellectual excitement that was involved in the invention of it can be a tremendous way of conveying to the students the excitement about the subject. So that's just one aspect of this question.
I love it, this notion of historicizing physics, not for in order to help students understand the power of the ideas and the importance of the discoveries.
So I would just like to lobby that innovation and current cutting-edge research is extremely important, and it has to be a part of what we do. But it shouldn't be the only thing. People in the past were just as smart as we are, and they were doing just as exciting and interesting things for them. And to understand how the ideas came about puts it in an entirely new context than just having to learn the dry ideas. Let me just leave it at that.
Excellent. Let me call on someone else on our panel to talk about engaging students.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit in reflection on those wonderful comments, because as a historian, I'm coming the opposite way, in the sense that your teaching is about trying to put people in the mindset in the past that discovered this beauty and perfection and symmetry of the universe, and teaching the history itself is kind of the opposite, in the sense that history is not beautiful. History is dirty. History is gritty. History is, which is not to say that the ideas that are being discovered in the past, if you're doing the history of science, are beautiful. They are, just as you described. But if anything is too beautiful in history, it's wrong. It's you're simplifying the sort of deep complexity of human experience that makes it interesting and worthwhile for the students. And all too often, the sort of move is to build a model to make that complexity into something that you can sort of grasp, holistically. And part of the task of the professor, or although only part, is to then punch a hole in that and to be like, let's move on to the next. Okay, so that's great to account for these 3 pieces of evidence that we've got, but here's 6 more pieces of evidence. So how do we then account for all of that? So I think that part of my strategy teaching is never to pose a question that has an answer. Or certainly not one where everyone would agree on the answer, because then if someone gets it, then the conversation is done, and no students are empowered to do the thinking for themselves, and we can't move on to the next question and the next question and the next question. So at a certain level, the classroom is all about seeing how far we can push into obscurity. It's like, we stand right up against the precipice of the kind of end of knowledge, and we peer out over the edge and try to take another step. And, a lot of times we're just going to fall. It's going to be like, oh, well, we can't figure that out. Sometimes we take another step and everyone's like, hey, that works. But then you're not done, right? That's not the sort of beautiful, elegant solution. That's then the invitation to the next step, when you're going to fall, and you're going to fall eventually. So it's a very different model, I think. I've been fascinated over the last couple of weeks getting to know this group, both in our disciplines and in our personalities, just how different we are in terms of how we engage with students.
Well, now I'm always going to think about history as dirty and gritty, which I hadn't thought about it that way before. So, Ethan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you position students to take part in these conversations in your course. Now, we observed you, the Committee on Teaching observed you kind of midstream, and we saw students, just already able to talk the talk. And sit in a chair the correct way. There's a historical way of looking and dressing even, I think. So they were already in it. So how is it that when you begin a class, especially with beginning students, that you position them to be able to engage with the ideas?
So look, history is an interpretive discipline. Like most of the humanities and most of the social sciences, the things that we human beings create don't admit of right and wrong answers. They admit of varying levels of persuasive interpretation. And the first thing every student has to learn in a humanities and social science classroom is that fact, right? Is the sense that actually you're going to be graded and judged, and your success in this class is going to be about how you interpret things. And so for one, modeling that. For another, putting on every prompt for a paper, 2 students in this class could write diametrically opposed arguments and both get A's. Right? This is not about the right answer. But then I think, most importantly, when we start discussing something at the beginning of every class, you know what I ask them? So what'd you think? And they'll sort of, sometimes someone will say something brilliant, and sometimes they'll blather for 15 minutes and say that it was hard, or say that they didn't understand this, or say that, whatever. But everyone gets to say what they thought, however much they want to. And that sense in which I care, and at the beginning of interpretation is one's own individual experience with the materials, I think is just essential to setting up that classroom for what you observed.
Well said. Well, thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to get really concrete. So apologies, even though I also agree with everything that's been said. But so my really concrete approach is to getting students engaged, meaning awake, their brains working decently well, feeling invested, and feeling responsible. So that's what I mean by engaged. So I also think it's critical to have them see that you're really excited by the topic, and that means that I weave in my research interests too. So when we get to some law that seems obscure, I'll say, and so this is what I've been struggling with in my own scholarship, this question of blah, 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 so they can see that the saga is ongoing. I try my best to know students' names and to remember which student said what, especially students who are a little bit shy and who really got out of their comfort zone by saying something. So I'll say, as Vanessa said 2 days ago, blah, blah, blah. And so that student feels like they were listened to. That student feels like they're part of the saga. And sometimes, anyway, I also I use hypotheticals a lot. So I'll use PowerPoint and I will put up a hypothetical on the board. And sometimes the question might be, why do we even have rules of evidence at all? Why not just let it all in? Why would we have rules of evidence in trials? And so I'll say, talk to your neighbor, in groups of 2 to 4 for the next 3 minutes, just get your feet wet. So I use that technique a lot, and I think what it does is it forces everybody to speak, so they're awake, literally awake. This is not a joke. Shy students are actually opening their mouths in a slightly less pressured environment than if you call on them individually. And then, and it also means that you're going to get some diametrically opposed views before people are tainted by hearing the other views of the entire class. And so and then it makes it easier and less pressure to then call on somebody and say, okay, this group over here, so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, what do you think? And they're more willing, they've vetted their opinion to 2 other trusted people, so they're less scared to say to the class what they came up with, because it's not just them, and it's like, what if I say something stupid? So, I also cold call to make sure that it's not just the usual suspects who are speaking, and and so the other reason to put up a hypothetical is to get students to realize that, sort of going back to what Robert was saying, that these questions go back to Euclid or the cavemen or whatever, that you put a hypothetical up on the board that's slightly absurd, where somebody is being accused of a crime under a statute that really doesn't require any moral wrongdoing whatsoever. And somebody's walking down the street, and so you say, and students will laugh, and so you'll say, what, I hear laughter, what's wrong with this? And you get the students to intuit the rule before you even show them the rule, and it makes them feel like they get it. That it's not just, you're not just throwing rules at them and saying memorize this. I also think it's critical to tell them the history of the rule, sort of like going back and feeling like none of this is inevitable, because that also reminds them that they make the law. They are the ones who have to, if they don't agree with something, they're going to have to be able to explain to a skeptical judge why they think it's wrong. And so maybe law is different from other disciplines in the sense that there's so much meta stuff going on in the classroom. They have to be learning how to actually say to somebody who disagrees with them why they're right. So that aspect of learning rhetoric is part of the classroom experience. Anyway, I'll stop there, but those are some thoughts.
I'm trying to resist asking questions as we go along, but I can't resist at the moment. So could I ask just one thing? I visited Andre's classroom, and just such a presence there in standing in front of all of these law students in the amphitheater. Do you see students taking on your presence, your way of interacting and talking? I'm just wondering if you quite literally act as a model for people who will have to stand up in front of courtrooms perhaps and master a sort of discourse.
I think what I try to model is being conversational but still rigorous and authoritative. And I think that's what you should be doing in an oral argument in front of a judge as well. You're trying to ennoble the court, be conversational, but not be overly informal. And that's a fine line. But so, yeah, you do that in your speech, but also your demeanor. I have to admit that one of the things I struggle with is that I don't like to leave the front and walk around like Phil Donahue. I don't feel comfortable with it. It's something that I struggle with. But I have heard that getting out from the lectern helps. And so it's something that honestly is on my to-do list to get more comfortable with. But you can, it's not just in your speech that you can be conversational. It's, or sometimes I'll say, we're not going to be big on ceremony today, to keep raising your hand if you have a question, but I'd really like to have a sort of a free-form discussion for the next few minutes about what you thought about that article. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. David, yeah.
So in terms of how I engage my students, it probably helps to maybe just talk for a few minutes about who my students are and why they're in classes in public policy. So I mostly have master students who have worked a few years and are back getting a professional degree, oftentimes with some very intense policy interest, whether it's racial inequality or environmental issues. Or I had one student who was a vegan, was a very very adamant animal rights advocate, wanted to work in that field. And so everybody comes with something that they want to do and some problem that they want to solve, and they want to devote their life in that way. And I think my principal teaching assignment is microeconomic theory for people who want to solve problems. And there is an aesthetic beauty to microeconomic theory in the sense that there are these models that are can be quite elegant and intellectually stimulating. But I think what motivates me and the way I try to engage them is just my honest belief in how relevant it is to pretty much any problem that they want to solve, and how important it is for them as a tool for thinking about best ways to achieve what they want to do. And I think perhaps the big challenge, however, is a lot of the baggage that comes along with microeconomics that people carry with them. So students will walk in and think that perhaps they're being handed kind of a neoliberal agenda, that I'm trying to indoctrinate them or something like that. And I do understand that the profession as a whole does have this kind of set of normative implications that are often drawn out in courses and they've heard before, and that can be a real barrier for some students. But that being said, what I try to do is in teaching microeconomic theory to students is try to show them literally how relevant it is in settings that they wouldn't imagine it would be. So for example, we spend an enormous amount of time when we model human behavior about talking about prices and how people respond to prices. And quite naturally, if the price of something goes up, you're going to want to buy less of that, and you might buy more of something else when a relative price changes. And you can think of that as kind of a metaphor for a lot of things. But when you go into the policy world, those prices, or that idea of a relative price, kind of pops up in strange ways. So for example, a local county trying to decide what to do with somebody who's been convicted of a felony can either keep the person in local jail or they can send them to state prison. And if they keep them in the local jail, then it's on the county's dime. If they send them to state prison, it's on the state's dime. So you basically have a marginal cost of 0 for sending someone to prison. You have a positive marginal cost for keeping someone local. And so what you might expect is, given those incentives, we have an incentive to send more people to prison than we otherwise would, right? And then not only that, there's actually instances where state legislatures have looked to local counties and said, if you send us, any juveniles that have been convicted of these series of crimes, you're going to pay half, right? And what do you see happens when they're faced with those new incentives? All of a sudden, they stop sending juveniles to state prisons, right? And so that literally is economics at work. Or if we think about anti-poverty policy, so a big issue that has always been kind of an underlying topic in the food stamps program concerns people selling their benefits to other people, right? That someone will get an allotment of food stamps, now it's on EBT cards, and then there's a black market for those benefits. And it's criminalized, right? And it's against the law to do it, and people have been punished for that, both on the buying end and on the selling end. But if we sort of break down the incentives for why people might be doing that, you can kind of understand, well, really the program is designed in such a way that there'll be some people who, for whom the benefit is greater than the amount that they're going to need for food, right, in the face of extreme constraints and need for money elsewhere. And it creates a natural incentive for people to, sell something that they value less than $1 to someone who values it at $1. And it's not an immoral behavior. It's just basically inherent in the incentive structure this program creates, and it's actually quite predictable, right? If you take the theory that you're learning and you use it to think through this, and then we have a debate about whether it should be criminalized or maybe we should just give people cash to begin with, and how that would impact welfare and people's consumption and so on and so forth. And so there's lots of opportunities to engage people on things that they care about. I think my favorite example over the past few years of a student that came in just saying I don't have any need for this stuff, and then had really transformed is actually my one vegan animal rights student, who very quickly had sort of started to think about ways that she can tax consuming meat, right, or sort of alter the relative price of a veggie burger or what have you. But you could just see the cogs in her mind just kind of go into work with an express purpose, right? That she wanted to discourage one activity or have less of that activity, encourage more of another. And despite the fact that we think about prices and income and efficiency and sort of utility and all of this language that perhaps you'd hear in an MBA course, these policy students, they become quite motivated, and they're smart, and they pick on it quite quickly and figure out ways to introduce it to the things they care about.
What happens in your classes when students come very differently prepared for dealing with the statistical analyses and the modeling and so on? I mean, my sense of one of the classes you were teaching is that students were coming from a variety of different places and kind of levels of preparation. So how do you keep the engagement there in a classroom that's so diverse in terms of preparation?
Well, that's definitely a challenge. Again, our students are all, they're all adults. They've all done well as undergrads, so they're generally predisposed to do well, but they definitely come in with quite drastically different backgrounds in terms of math preparation and in terms of their exposure to statistical analysis or economics or whatever it is that I'm assigned to teach at the moment. I think, frankly, we do get a lot of help, at least in my school, from other lecturers who will do prep courses and that sort of thing. But it's just kind of incumbent upon us to not assume anything. And if you have to spend extra time going over how a summation sign works, or describing exactly what a derivative means and how you take it in these limited settings, or to work through an expectations operator and what that means and relate it to something they can care about or something they can understand, you just have to do it, right? And that's the way it is. And I've been doing this now for quite some time, and it's I've never had the case where I've had someone who just couldn't do it, and then I've often had the case where people come in without technical background, and by the end of the year they're like, I want to do more of that, and that's what I want to do with my living. So you have to give people a chance and meet them where they are, and a lot of people will catch up if they're expected to do so. Yeah.
Let's see if you have questions or comments that you want to make. I've got a whole list of questions here, but I'd love to get you involved in this conversation with our distinguished teachers. Yes.
Just a question for Steve, following up on that last thing. I've often felt that I would be a much better teacher if I could figure out how to teach students to be good consumers of electronic and statistical work. And yet the only way I know how to do that is to try to teach them to be baby producers, which is very hard. And I'm wondering if you have magic insights, because people do indeed love what you do.
Oh, I don't know if I have. I think I do the same thing. That I try to make them producers, or at least when I do teach statistical modeling, we have a very actually one kind of easy tool that we can use is that oftentimes there will be very clear examples of empirical papers out there where people have posted their data and they've posted their programs. So, for example, a paper or study that we use in our econometric sequence, and a lot of faculty have used it, is there was a paper written by two professors that created a bunch of fictitious resumes and then randomly assigned names to the resumes where they took the names that were most likely to be African American names and names that were most likely to be white names, signed the resumes, and then sent them out and saw whether they got callbacks, trying to investigate whether it's discrimination. So it's basically a randomized controlled trial. The statistics are relatively easy. The data's super clean. And one way that you can get students to understand exactly what's behind that study is you can say, okay, here's the data. We've been studying these methods. We've been studying how to code. Go reproduce their results, right? And so, they know what the right answer is because it's right there in the published, and they have the data. They can go look for the programs if they want. But it's a very quick way, in some ways, to experientially understand what it means to produce research and to make the connection between a lot of output from a statistics program and then that cleaned table in a published article. And so I do, try to do quite a bit of that. And then also, there's no substitute for reading papers and having them as a group come up with the weaknesses, right? And every paper, no matter how famous it is, or is to some degrees has flaws. We have to convince them of that, right? That we try to, at least as social scientists, think about what the central tendency of a body of findings is, and we don't completely change everything we believe because of one study, and you just need practice, right, and exposure.
I'm curious what you all do or try to do differently in teaching than the other people in your department or program.
Ethan.
There's something I've noticed about lecturing. I mean, we've talked a lot about sort of very intimate sort of classroom relationships with students, but a lot of what we do is lecturing. And one thing I've noticed watching other professors lecture in my department, especially when I was department chair, is that they tend to just get up and start lecturing about the subject of the day without the slightest need to explain to the students why on earth they're wasting 80 minutes of the students' valuable time with this subject. And it's something that I've done for a long time without realizing that I was doing it, but in more recent years I've really thought a lot about it. The fact that every lecture needs to begin with some disguised or not disguised version of, this is why I'm going to waste 80 minutes of your time. This is why actually this subject is important. And in particular, I like to try, if possible, not why it's important to me, or even why it's important to some sort of mythical world, but why it's important to you. Why this might be a subject that you could have at the center of your understanding and learning. It might somehow change who you are. And I think this is not something that's sort of common to lecturing on this campus or any campus, I don't think.
Cool. So the pressure's on because two of my most effective teaching colleagues are in the room. So, but I think something I try to do that I think law professors could do more of is to see that there is not a conflict between being empathetic and being rigorous in the classroom. And so starting 150 years ago, there's this sense of, using the Socratic method, which I believe in strongly, but the idea that it has to be adversarial, like the paper chase, like the movies, as compared, there are wrong answers. There are wrong answers. And so being empathetic does not mean saying, oh, it's okay that you gave a wrong answer. Being empathetic is staying with that student, caring about them, understanding it, staying with them in a way that's not adversarial until they have gotten there, and showing that you care that they've gotten there and that you're proud of them. I don't think there's anything wrong or not rigorous about those things that I just said. And so I think that the culture among law professors is still to sort of be the paper chase, because that's what people have in their mind's eye. So that's my hope is to change that sort of one classroom at a time.
Okay. I'm going to try to. Boy, that's a tough one. I would actually say that there's a lot of things that my colleagues do that I kind of envy, and I wish I was better at. Right. So, I have several colleagues who are really, really good at teaching using case studies. That they'll introduce something at the very beginning of a class, whether it's a debate around a food program or a particular decision that was made by a legislature, and then they're quite good at sort of having everybody very conversationally analyze the case and arrive at a general set of lessons that they conclude at the end. I have other colleagues who have they'll do exercises like take our 100+ master students, split them into Democrats and Republicans, and have them balance the federal budget. Which is kind of an amazing thing that it happens each year, and the students really get into it, and they kind of almost they channel like actual personalities. Like one person becomes Mitch McConnell, and the other person, and I think the courses I teach, since they tend to be more technical, there's a lot of, okay, we're just going to work through, everybody's going to eat their spinach with me, so I don't have the opportunity to do those things, but I have a lot of respect for my colleagues, and they do things that are different, and they do it well.
First of all, I have to say that I almost never see my colleagues teaching, and they don't see me either. I think in the process of this DTA award, this was the first time in 35 years that any of my colleagues, or even outside the department, ever saw my teaching. So that's the first thing to say. But I do see my colleagues in seminars and in lectures they give, in presentations and in conferences and formats like that. And in one particular case, in the case of Rich Muller, who was a former DTA award from several years ago, was also in my department. I know about him because some of his lectures are on YouTube. And my daughter and I have watched them because she's trying to learn physics, and so we watch him. Anyway, first of all, I have to say that a lot of the presentations that are given in seminars Well, they cover the material that the person wants to present, but as presentations, they're quite poor. On the other hand, Rich Muller is magnificent. He's a real showman. He knows how to connect to the emotions of the audience. He's got perfect timing. He knows what's going to engage their curiosity about the next step and so on. So anyway, these are so. It's not, as I recall, when you asked this question, one of the things I should address was my colleagues and how they're different from what I do. Is that right? Okay. Well, so I started out by being critical of some of my colleagues when they give presentations. One of it is, I think, part of it is I think in many cases they don't prepare well enough. So they come up and they know the general idea of the sequence of topics they want to present, but they don't have the transitions worked out. They're doing it on the fly. And so there's a lot of and well and a little bit of circumlocution until they find their way to go on to the next step. And I think this has a really negative effect on the ability of the audience to follow what's going on. It's not that it's impossible to follow it, but it interrupts your line of thinking, and you have to exert extra effort to follow the logic. So the transitions, I think, from one subject to the next, and this involves not only a piece in between one subject and the next, but also how you end the old subject so that it leads into the next subject. And I think attention to those kinds of details can make a big difference between an ordinary ho-hum presentation and one that really has an impact. I think there's research on this, but this is my own anecdotal observations, is that there's another factor too, and when you spend a lot of time hemming and hawing on trying to make a transition from one subject to the next, it slows down your progress. Now, you might think that if you went slower so that you covered less material, you'd think the audience might get it better because they have more time to think about it. But actually, in my experience, it's the opposite. If you have good transitions, you end up not only covering more material, but the audience gets it better. At least that's what they'll say afterwards. Anyway, it altogether makes a much better presentation. So anyway, maybe I should stop because I don't want to criticize the average scientific presentation in a seminar too much, but most of them are at best mediocre in my opinion. So.
I love that attention to detail. Is there another question? Yes, there you go.
Ethan, I was glad to hear you talking about the problem of teaching interpretive subjects and that there are often no concrete answers or no right answers. And I deal with this all the time because I teach environmental ethics, bioethics, environmental history, and I have in my classes a lot of engineering and science students who are used to there being a right answer. And I just wonder if you could elaborate any more on how I don't know if you have that problem to transition students into a different way of thinking in your classes, but I wonder if you could give me any advice on that.
I mean, you put the problem perfectly, that there is a kind of disciplinary divide. I think it's a divide that it redounds to the detriment of our side of campus in the broader educational sphere, in the sense that so much research on education is based on courses where there are consistent data sets that can be reproduced from university to university, class to class, professor to professor, that have to be the kinds of classes that admit right answers. And so there's so much less pedagogical research on the kind of thing that we do. So how to do that? I mean, I think a lot of it is about me modeling multiple different interpretations of the same material by way of not explaining. I mean, of course, I'm going to have my own views about things. But what I like to do is try to point out what's at stake in a different interpretation, right? Not just like, is one better attested, can you produce better evidence for one than another, but what's at stake if you then keep following that interpretation down the line, so that the students become aware of a kind of politics with a small p that's behind all of the answers that they come up with in classroom settings. I mean, I think so much of it is just that kind of training in self-awareness of what it means when they put data points together to come up with a certain answer, right? That they haven't just answered that question. They've opened up, they've opened up one horizon and they've closed off others. So, I mean, but I don't have a good answer to it. I mean, the problem is the problem. That it's so much easier. I mean, there was a question about inclusivity that Glinda also asked, and I feel like the question of inclusiveness in the classroom and this question of interpretation dovetail beautifully together, because everyone wants their point of view to be included. And I think if you can convince students that what it means to be inclusive of them and their point of view is actually to put a huge burden on them to try to really get things, to come up with the evidence to convince people of their point of view, that's another way to sort of approach this problem.
A lot of students are uncomfortable when there's no correct answer.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, no, it's a huge burden. I mean, it's the burden of what we do. So I feel that burden too, right? When we publish, it's terrifying to, spend years working on this material and then put it out there for all the smartest people to rip it apart, right? And that sense of the burden of interpretation is enormous, and to try to make students feel comfortable with that this is not a space in which I'm going to rip apart what you're saying. We're all going to try to come up with the next and the next and the next. That's the game.
So there was one question. Thank you for asking that question, because I was curious about that too. Ethan, you also mentioned that students also fall, right? And Andrea, you mentioned that you scaffold with students and you believe in them, you are there. And I wondered what are ways you help students recover from failure? How do you deal with that in the class? How do you help them get up and make sure that failure is part of the learning process? And I wonder if you have any comments on it.
So one thing I do is related to something that at the ceremony folks said that Stephen says in his class all the time, which is, well, let's think about it, or am I getting that right? Well, so if a student gives the wrong answer to a question like, how would this come out under Rule X, where there really is a right answer, or at least under current doctrine there's a right answer, I'll basically say, well, let's go back to the let's go back to what the definition of hearsay is. Okay, so, John, is this an assertion? And so they are empowered because I'm still asking them questions, but I'm going back to the building blocks, and they will get the right answer. And then eventually it's like, oh, yeah, yes, okay, yes, it is. Now I see why it would be inadmissible or whatever. But not even to say, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong, but just let's go back to the request. So they already know that they've given the wrong answer, but it's not because I've said you're wrong. But it's still not ambiguous. And yeah.
Well, I guess I do something similar, I think, and yes, people will sort of get things wrong. They'll do poorly on exams. It happens, but people are trying and they're learning, and that's just part of learning. We all make mistakes, and I think part of the making students realize that that's not the end of the world is to let them know that you're human too. You can make mistakes and you can get things wrong in front of the class, and you can not know the right answer and have to come back next time, and just try to be a little humble in front of them as well, and human, and realize that at one point I was the student trying to understand and getting things wrong, and that it's okay, right? That's just part of learning. It's part of growth.
So we're almost out of time, I'm sorry to say, and I want to end with one question that you can answer quickly if possible. When you get an award like this, it's sort of the pinnacle of a teaching award at Berkeley, and people expect that you know all the answers and that you're going to have to do many panels like this for the rest of your teaching time at Berkeley. But I suspect that there are some things that you want to work on in terms of your teaching. And I wonder what those would be. If you had to choose an area that would take your teaching even to another level, that would give you more satisfaction in the classroom, that would help your students feel more included, whatever the criteria you want to use, what would you work on next in terms of your teaching?
I can be pretty quick.
Okay.
If that, one is to teach my 45-year-old brain to continue to be ready to practice and practice and practice, not ever misgendering students. And so I've done it. I've apologized. Students have been very gracious, but it's something that I struggle with cognitively. Number two is to be better at figuring out how to do those broad conversations about what do you think about X. I think I'm pretty practiced in explaining a doctrine, but when it comes to, yeah, well, do you think this is a good idea or not, and that free-floating discussion, I am still struggling with how best to choreograph those. So those are that's my to-do list.
Sure. I would say the one thing that I struggle with and have for 25 years, and I'm constantly trying to tinker around the edges, is simply developing meaningful assignments that are challenging, that are engaging the material, and that are
Doable.
that are doable, and where they're going to learn, right, and where it's going to reinforce what we're doing in the classroom, so they can read. They can talk about it with their fellows, they can try to teach others, but you really learn it by doing. And ultimately, we all had our own path, how we, got good at something or failed to get good at something, and it's hard to sort of bottle that and figure out how to propel people in the right direction.
I don't cold call, and I'm not good at. I think I'm not good on the fly at remembering that the students who aren't talking, some of them may not get what's going on, and I think that I get so excited about the success and the thought that is being produced that I have a really hard time stopping. And I mean, I think that the less strong students like me because I make them laugh and because I'm good at choosing material that's interesting. I mean, I'm fine at all of that, but I think that I run out ahead of the students too often, and I'm engaged with the best students, and I'd like to think about how to get the rest more involved.
This is hard to address in a short answer. There are so many things that I'd like to improve. Some of them just involve extra time. I've had this year I've had very good interactions with students in office hours. It's been the most satisfying part of my course, but it's only been a small number of students, and I'd like to find a way to engage larger numbers of them. This might mean that I should take over discussion sections, which are now handled by GSIs. The classes I tend to teach are rather large, so I have GSI help. I have one GSI, but I think that to be able to, so in a discussion section, you answer the questions the students ask. I don't anyway. I don't prepare anything, and I think that puts you in closer contact with them as individuals. I'd be happy if more of them would come to my office hours. I think that would be good too, but they're shy, and it's hard to persuade them to do that. Anyway, that's just one aspect of it.
Oh, I'm sorry we've come to the end of our time. I feel as if this conversation could just go on, and I'm inspired all over again by being able to engage with these great teachers, and I hope there will be many more opportunities across the next year and years to have conversations like this. Really, really helpful. And thank you for being such a great and engaged audience. And a round of applause for the 2019